What makes this especially astonishing is that 1,000 years ago, China was the greatest empire on Earth. Then, it lost its competitive edge on Europe and essentially turned into an impoverished, underdeveloped rural nation. In the 20th century, China went through three political regimes, from a monarchy to a socialist government, and endured several civil wars. Yet, it managed to leverage its underdeveloped status and eventually became the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. Consider this: 50 years ago, 4 out of 5 Chinese people worked in the fields, and 96% of the population lived below the poverty line. Today, China produces nearly a third of all goods on the planet, engages in trade wars, and competes in the space race against Russia and the United States, all under the rule of the Communist Party and without widespread democracy. How did China manage, in just 30 years, to surpass nations once thought impossible to catch? Let's dive into the unique story of how the oldest living empire is reclaiming its dominance. This map shows where the world's earliest civilizations emerged. The oldest known to us is Mesopotamia, which appeared around 6,000 years ago in what is now Iraq. 1,000 years later, the Harappan civilization arose in modern-day Pakistan, and in North Africa, the Egyptian civilization emerged where pharaohs built monumental tombs for themselves. However, most of these civilizations have vanished, and only the youngest, the Chinese civilization, which began 4,000 years ago, not only still exists, but also contests for global economic leadership. That said, if we look at China 4,000 years ago, it wasn't a united, powerful state, but rather a collection of kingdoms, each with its own rulers. You may have heard about the 8,000-strong terracotta army discovered 50 years ago in eastern China. These are the guardians of the tomb of China's first emperor, who in year 221 BC united the Chinese principalities under his rule. From this time onward, the territory of the Chinese Empire expanded and engaged in trade with other Asian peoples, leading to the creation of the Great Silk Road. Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain reached as far as the Roman Empire, but China fiercely guarded its technologies under penalty of death and did not approve of foreigners' access. Even the main producers of silk reached Europe through deception. There's an entire espionage story behind it. Byzantine Emperor Justinian I sent 2 monks to steal silkworms for him, and they smuggled silkworm larvae hidden inside their bamboo staffs. Just getting to China was quite the challenge. To the west were the towering Himalayas, to the north the vast Gobi Desert, and to the south impassable jungles, while lone traders and monks, driven by profit or faith, made their way to China, the great armies of Western empires could not. This isolation gave China a monopoly on unique goods valued around the world. In these conditions, the unique Chinese worldview of the Middle Kingdom emerged, where China considered itself the center of the world. Everything beyond its borders was seen as chaotic, wild, and barbaric. Naturally, this led to a sense of superiority and aloofness toward Europeans. But everything began to change in the 16th century when Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India, which was not far from China's shores. One after another, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later English ships arrived at the southern Chinese port of Guangzhou in search of new markets. Guangzhou gradually became an international port, and the Chinese emperor allowed foreigners to establish trading posts there. However, they were not allowed deeper into the country, nor could they settle in China with their families. Additionally, China only agreed to trade in silver. If we look at the world's reserves of precious metals, we'll see that China had very little. Take a look at the silver production statistics for the 16th to 19th centuries. During this period, about 80% of the world's silver was mined in the Americas, specifically in present-day Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. Interestingly, due to this lack of precious metals, China was the first to invent paper money as early as the 12th century. However, the paper was of poor quality and easily counterfeited, so silver remained highly valued and Chinese merchants primarily accepted it as payment. As a result, a third of all silver mined by Spain was shipped across the Pacific from the Mexican port of Acapulco to the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea for European buyers. As for China, it needed little from foreigners beyond silver. The goods of European barbarians were considered inferior. In the 17th century, China's population was estimated at around 170 million, more than all of Europe's, allowing China to be largely self-sufficient. Fertile lands and a large population made China independent of external influences during the pre-industrial era. Looking at China's share of the global economy, we see that until the early 19th century, it accounted for about a quarter of the world's GDP. But then, its share began to decline sharply. Why is that? If we exclude the factor of China's large population in the era before the Industrial Revolution and examine its GDP per capita, we find that this figure remained stagnant. It was around $600 for centuries. China's stability was maintained by imperial rule and a massive agrarian economy. However, its isolation from the rest of the world slowed technological innovation and population growth consumed any economic progress. In contrast, Western European nations constantly competed for economic and political dominance, driving production, trade, and technological exchange. For example, gunpowder, invented in China in the 9th century, was primarily used for peaceful purposes, like fireworks or warding off evil spirits. But by the 13th century, when the technology reached Europe, it was refined and changed the course of history. Europeans competed to improve the quality and mass production of firearms, increasing the range and lethality of bullets, making the strength of an army reliant on its firepower. This arms race later enabled Western European nations to conquer colonies worldwide, leveraging their resources and slave labor to fuel rapid economic growth. Leading this arms race was Britain, which pioneered manufacturing rifles and laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. It was Britain that would ultimately bring mighty China to its knees, triggering the decline of its economy. Until the mid-20th century, 85% of the Chinese population lived in rural areas and worked the land. In England, however, this was the case only until the mid-19th century. Then the Industrial Revolution took place and people began moving to cities to work in factories. Thanks to technological progress, Britain not only conquered colonies but also needed new markets for its manufactured goods, and the Chinese market was an ideal candidate. In the 1760s, about 20 foreign ships entered China annually. By the 1840s, that number had grown to over 300, partially because the British had developed a taste for tea, which became one of Europe's key export goods. It's no surprise that Britain began to feel constrained in China. The Crown wanted to maintain a positive trade balance, selling more goods than it purchased. This supported domestic manufacturers and encouraged consumption of British products, while also ensuring a steady flow of silver and gold into the treasury. In 1793, a British delegation arrived at the Chinese Emperor's court with a letter from the King of Great Britain. In the letter, the king proposed a trade agreement to open new ports and establish favorable trade conditions. The Chinese emperor politely explained that the Middle Kingdom had no intention of changing anything for foreigners and, in essence, dismissed the British crown, suggesting they had no authority to make demands of the Emperor of the Sun. It's understandable as China followed its own policy of mercantilism, ensuring gold and silver remained within the country rather than being spent on foreign goods. This response didn't satisfy Britain, which then sought a product to hook China on. That product turned out to be opium. While opium had already been used in China as a painkiller, the discovery of tobacco after the European colonization of the Americas introduced smoking to China, and it quickly gained popularity. Incidentally, China is now the world's largest tobacco producer, and nearly half of the male population smokes cigarettes. So how does opium fit in? People soon realized they could mix opium with tobacco and smoke the resulting narcotic blend. The morphine in opium is highly addictive, making it difficult to quit. This created a lucrative market for opium in China. In their Indian colonies, the British established a vast poppy plantations, exporting the harvest to China. Understanding that Chinese silver was flowing into British coffers while the population suffered, the Chinese emperor banned the import of opium in 1800. However, no bans or punishments stopped the trade. Thanks to smuggling, opium imports increased ninefold over the next 40 years. Eventually, Chinese authorities lost patience and made a radical decision. In 1839, Chinese officials demanded that the British surrender the opium stored in warehouses in the coastal city of Guangzhou. When the British refused, they were declared prisoners. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, they handed over hundreds of tons of opium, which Chinese authorities confiscated and burned. The official leading this operation, Lin Zexu, sent a letter to Queen Victoria stating, "By what right do you use poisonous medicine to harm the Chinese people? Let's ask, where is your conscience?" The letter was never read by the Queen, but Britain now had a pretext to invade China. That same year, when Lin Zexu destroyed British opium, the British Navy arrived off the coast of China, starting the First Opium War. The disparity in military technology was so great that 4,000 British ships defeated a Chinese army of 90,000, forcing the Middle Kingdom to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanking. Under the treaty, China not only paid compensation for the destroyed opium, 8 million kilograms of silver, but also ceded Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity and opened 5 ports: Guangzhou, Shanghai, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Xiamen to British trade. Each port was governed by British authorities. Of course, the sale of opium was not legalized, but smuggling became at least 6 times easier. When in 1856, Chinese authorities detained another British ship for piracy and opium smuggling, Britain bombarded Guangzhou. Thus began the Second Opium War, which China also lost and was ultimately forced to legalize opium imports. Think about this. Opium sales accounted for half of all exports by the British East India Company to China. The most devastating consequence was that growing opium became more profitable than anything else, so more and more arable land in China was dedicated to poppies. By the early 20th century, 1 in 4 adult men in China smoked opium. No, China didn't become a colony like India, but its worldview, where the Middle Kingdom was the center of the universe, was shattered. The so-called barbarians proved to be stronger, craftier, and more powerful. Imagine being a mighty empire that people from around the world once revered. Now, parts of your territory are effectively occupied by foreigners who do as they please. This national tragedy is referred to in China as the Century of Humiliation. Naturally, the emperor's image in the eyes of the people was severely undermined, and China began to transform from a unified state into a country on the brink of civil war for power, a struggle to return China to its former glory. By the early 20th century, China's economy was in a severe crisis. Intellectuals and military figures demanded the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Moreover, China had a clear example of an alternative path. Japan, which had recently been in a similar position, managed to undergo the major restoration, dismantled its feudal system, and emerged as a leader in the global economy. Despite the faltering Qing dynasty's attempts to implement liberal reforms, living standards improved slowly, and the political elite remained closely tied to Western capital. This dissatisfaction among the military and the general population eventually culminated in the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, forcing the last emperor of China to resign. Afterward, China descended into a period of political anarchy, during which numerous factions clashed across the country. The two dominant political forces at the time were the Communist Party of China and the Nationalist Party. The CPC, inspired by the Russian October Revolution, garnered significant support among the peasant majority. On the other hand, the KMT aligned itself with the industrial and land-owning elites, drawing inspiration from the West and Japan while advocating for gradual reforms. This rivalry led to a civil war, with the more organized and larger KMT initially emerging victorious. This political shift alarmed Japan, which had its sights on China's territories and resources. Japan preferred a fragmented China to prevent the emergence of a strong central government. Consequently, in 1937, war broke out between Japan and China. Faced with a common enemy, the CPC and KMT temporarily set aside their differences. The KMT's regular army engaged Japanese forces head-on, while the CPC's guerrilla units carried out sabotage missions in Japanese-occupied areas. However, the Japanese perceived the KMT as their main adversary, leading to severe losses for the nationalists, who were less technologically advanced. Meanwhile, the communist guerrilla movement gained traction as they effectively undermined Japanese positions. By the time Japanese surrendered in 1945, the KMT was significantly weakened. Their ruling party was mired in corruption and no longer resonated with the populace as strongly as the heroic communists. Moreover, Mao Zedong, the CPC leader, strengthened ties with the Soviet Union, an influential neighbor. As a result, when civil war resumed in post-World War II China, the communist forces emerged victorious. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The KMT was pushed southward and eventually retreated to Taiwan, where its isolation protected it from communist influence. Under the US Navy's protection, Taiwan became a stronghold for the KMT as the US sought to counterbalance the growing alliance between China and the USSR. While Europeans once profited greatly from China, they were gradually displaced by Japan. After World War II, China, like much of Asia, fell under the influence of two superpowers, the US and the USSR. Initially, the US refused to recognize Mao's government and shifted its focus to bolstering the economies of Japan and South Korea to maintain influence in Southeast Asia. Despite gaining independence for the first time in over a century, Mao's rule from 1949 to 1976 was one of the most contentious periods in China's history. Why is that? The Communist Party embarked on a typical socialist agenda, including the nationalization of industries, collectivization of agriculture, and a shift to a planned economy. This was done with substantial Soviet support in the form of raw materials, equipment, and expertise. The goal was to rapidly transition China from an agrarian country to an industrial powerhouse. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, aiming to modernize China by exponentially increasing agricultural output by 2.5 times and industrial by 6.5 times. Steel production became a priority, with Mao ambitiously planning to surpass Britain's steel output within 15 years. However, the lack of technology and resources made these goals unattainable. To meet quotas, rural communes were established, where workers were compensated with food instead of wages, often as little as 250 grams of food per day. In essence, the Stalinist principle of who does not work does not eat was established. Hard to determine how effective this policy was, but instead of building factories like in USSR, in China, villagers were instructed to set up backyard furnaces. Under orders from the party, peasants melted down everything that could be smelted: farming tools, kitchen utensils, and other household items. It reached the point where people abandoned working in the fields entirely, dedicating themselves entirely to this new craft. As a result, fields were left unattended and crops rotted. On paper, steel production indeed increased, with propaganda heralding the achievements of the hard-working people. However, the quality of the steel was abysmal, unable to compete on any global scale. At the same time, Mao launched a campaign against four pests: sparrows, rats, mosquitoes, and flies. The great helmsman believed this would protect crops, boost harvests, and improve the nation's health, as these pests were seen as disease carriers. The primary target of this campaign were sparrows. Estimates suggest that nearly 2 billion sparrows were eradicated during the campaign, leaving China virtually devoid of these birds. Initially, crop yields did increase, but it was soon discovered that sparrows consumed not only grain, but also insects.
What a twist!
Without this natural predator, pests like locusts and caterpillars proliferated across China, devastating crops. By 1960, recognizing the error, China imported 250,000 sparrows from the USSR to restore the bird population and rebalance the ecosystem. The results of Mao's populist policies, from the introduction of labor days to the eradication of sparrows, were catastrophic. The country experienced one of the deadliest famines in human history, with estimates of deaths ranging from 20 to 45 million people. Eventually, these reforms were abandoned, and blame for the failures was shifted to local officials, accusing them of incompetence and improper execution of the great helmsman's directives. However, the next decade of Communist Party rule still failed to transform China into a leading industrial power. By the 1970s, China remained an agrarian country. 4 out of 5 Chinese citizens worked on the fields, their primary tool being a hoe rather than a tractor. Moreover, 96% of the population lived below the poverty line, subsisting mainly on rice. This was the reality year after year. Despite these challenges, Mao's cult of personality remained unshakable, bolstered by relentless propaganda. For example, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong became the third most published book globally, with nearly 1 billion copies in circulation, surpassed only by the Bible and the Quran. However, Mao's legacy was not solely about questionable reforms and slow economic growth. Imagine yourself as a Chinese peasant. Just a couple of decades earlier, you lived in a country perpetually at war. Then, a leader emerged, bringing peace and restoring your nation's status as a power to be reckoned with. Under Mao, you and your children could receive at least basic free education. In just 10 years, illiteracy rates fell by a third, and medical insurance became available to many. Ordinary people felt that the state cared for them and that the great husband was leading the country toward a brighter future. Yet, all of this seems more like elements of propaganda than evidence of explosive economic growth. China remained a third world country. So how did China manage to change the course of its history and build one of the strongest economies on the planet? To answer this question, we must turn to the architect of China's great economic miracle, the second most popular figure in the Communist Party after Mao, Deng Xiaoping. In 1976, the great husband Mao Zedong passed away, and Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China's political elite. Deng, who had walked the path from revolution and civil war to the party elite alongside Mao differed greatly from his predecessor. Unlike Mao, Deng didn't classify reforms into bad, market-oriented ones and good, socialist ones. He famously said, "It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat. If it catches mice, it is a good cat." In December 1978, during a plenary session of the CCP Central Committee, Deng Xiaoping announced a new party course. Blind adherence to Mao's teachings and Marxist ideological dogmas was abandoned in favor of any rational ideas and proposals that could be implemented. In practice, this new approach looked like this. While Deng was planning reforms, farmers in small village of Anhui province secretly agreed to divide the communal farmland among themselves. They pledged to meet the government grain quota but would keep any surplus for their personal use. Doesn't this smell of capitalism? How could individuals work their own plots instead of sharing everything collectively? In the very first year of this improvised experiment, the village experienced a surge in productivity, catching the attention of the authorities. But instead of repression, as might have occurred under Mao, the party praised the village's success. In September 1979, this system was expanded to other provinces. Under this system, if farmers fulfilled their quotas, they could officially retain any surplus crops for their own use or sale. Thanks to this system, over the next 5 years, agricultural productivity in China grew by more than 1.5 times. By 1984, collective farms in China had nearly disappeared and most agricultural land had been transferred to families for use. However, this land was not privately owned but leased to families. Notably, even today, individuals in China cannot own land outright. They can only lease it from the state for a period of time. With Deng Xiaoping's leadership, the CCP began introducing market elements into the planned economy, creating what they called socialism with Chinese characteristics. The sharp increase in agricultural efficiency left nearly half of the rural population without work. However, unlike in the past, when farmers were tied to their collectives, they could now seek other jobs. Moreover, the party allowed small businesses, leading to a proliferation of small shops, barber shops, and beauty salons in Chinese cities. Against this backdrop, the continuation of private business to the economy began to grow rapidly. 20 years after the reforms began, private enterprises contributed more to the economy than state-owned ones, even within a planned economy with a strong Communist Party influence. However, even after Deng Xiaoping's initial market reforms, China still lagged behind Western Europe, the US, and Japan. To catch up, it needed to learn from their technologies. In 1978, a plane carrying high-ranking party members left China for a tour of developed countries in Europe and Southeast Asia. In essence, this trip was akin to Japan's Iwakura mission a century earlier, where officials studied foreign technology. Deng Xiaoping himself embarked on diplomatic tours to strengthen relations with neighboring and Western nations, actions that the Soviet Union might have viewed as betrayal. But there was nothing surprising about this. After World War II, China and the USSR were united by the friendship between Mao and Stalin. However, after the Soviet leader's death, Khrushchev came to power and began to dismantle Stalin's cult of personality.
Или партия открыто, по-ленински смело осудит порожденные в период культа личности Сталина ошибки и извращения.
Mao, who regained Stalin as his teacher, could not tolerate this, and relations between the two countries deteriorated. This tension even escalated to an armed clash on the border in 1969. By the late 1970s, China's friendship with the USSR was just a memory. When Deng Xiaoping began implementing market-based economic reforms, Moscow was left off the Chinese leader's program altogether. Moreover, observing the economic and political stagnation in the USSR during the 1970s, China drew its own conclusions. First, in 1982, China adopted a new constitution limiting an individual's tenure in state office to 2 5-year terms. This was aimed at ensuring a rotation of power and renewal of party cadres. Besides, then decentralized power so that provinces only had to pay a fixed portion of their revenue to Beijing, keeping the rest of local projects. Funds were allocated where necessary, preventing embezzlement. Career advancement in the party was directly tied to how well a leader managed the region and how robustly the local economy grew. In fact, the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, rose to power through this very mechanism. He achieved remarkable results in Zhejiang province, entered the top tier of party leadership, and eventually won the political struggle at the highest level. After Sino-Soviet relations cooled, the United States quickly assumed the role of China's friend. In 1972, US President Richard Nixon visited Shanghai and posed for photos at the Great Wall of China. China began sending its doctors and scientists to the United States for training, while American engineers came to China as consultants. This gradual collaboration led to Washington recognizing the One China policy in 1979, which acknowledged Taiwan as part of China. However, the US did not entirely renounce its claims to the island, where opponents of Chinese communism had fled. The US signed a separate agreement with Taiwan to maintain trade and unofficial ties, where China sought American capital and technology, which were critically needed. Taiwan wasn't China's only disputed territory. For instance, Hong Kong was essentially British territory. After losing the First Opium War in 1842, China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and in 1897, the crown leased it for 99 years. In 1984, Deng Xiaoping met with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, to determine Hong Kong's future. On one hand, it was to return unconditionally to China. On the other, years of British influence had transformed Hong Kong into a global financial hub with values different from mainland China. Thatcher pushed to maintain Hong Kong's capitalist system, arguing that its westernized Chinese residents would struggle to integrate into new reality. Deng Xiaoping, however, insisted that Hong Kong become an inseparable part of Chinese culture with some concessions. Ultimately, they agreed. Britain would return Hong Kong to China in 1997, but Hong Kong would retain its independent financial and legal systems based on British law and autonomy in all areas except defense and foreign policy for 50 years. This arrangement became known as One Country, Two Systems. The former British colony proved invaluable to China's economy. Nearly 60% of Chinese foreign direct investment flows through Hong Kong. However, to ensure the economy did not solely rely on Hong Kong, China established special economic zones along its coast. These areas offered tax breaks and exemptions from duties to foreign companies. In 1980, 4 CEZs were created: Xiamen, Shantou, Zhuhai, and Shenzhen. While special economic zones are common worldwide, China outperformed others by leveraging one key factor: labor costs. Simply take the world's most populous country where living standards are very low, and you have the perfect labor market for any foreign company. As a result, labor costs in 1980s China were the lowest in Southeast Asia. Provinces declared as special economic zones began growing at extraordinary rates. For example, Shenzhen's GDP grew from 196 million yuan in 1979 to over 2.5 trillion yuan by 2019. The secret to this growth lay not only in economic openness, but also in China's political structure established by Deng Xiaoping. The entire country became a massive competitive market where every official sought ways to elevate their province, with foreign investments fueling this progress. Yet, China did not become a democracy, nor did the party transform into a liberal government. Interestingly, all Chinese banknotes bear the portraits of Mao Zedong, not Deng Xiaoping. Deng did not dismantle Mao's cult of personality as Khrushchev had done with Stalin. Mao remained and still remains a national symbol. This approach had its logic. Any successor who criticized Mao would undermine the party's authority. In China, criticism and change are possible for everything except 4 pillars: the socialist path, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the party's leading role, and Mao Zedong's ideas. This socialism with Chinese characteristics produced intriguing contradictions. Allowing enterprises to sell surplus products on the market created a dual pricing system. The government bought goods at plant prices while citizens paid at market prices. This dual pricing system spurred inflation, which reached 19% in 1988 and 24% in 1994. People protested against the consequences of these reforms. The most famous protest occurred at Tiananmen Square in 1989. You may have seen the photo of a man stopping a column of tanks. That happened at Tiananmen Square when the Chinese government deployed troops to surpass the unrest. Official casualty figures are unavailable and any mention of the event is censored. Whether it was a coincidence or not, during these events, Deng Xiaoping retired from official politics, voluntarily stepping down and passing leadership to a younger generation. In 1992, he toured southern China, personally meeting local officials to emphasize the importance of the reforms, ensuring the country would not revert to a conservative governance model but continue its policies of openness and careful market reforms. The significance and success of this tour can be seen in the surge of foreign direct investment in China after 1992. Still, while Deng Xiaoping led the foundation for modern China's economic power, this is not where the story ends. How China became the world's leading economy, flooded global markets with its products, and emerged as the main competitor to the United States deserves special attention. You're listening to the story about socialism with Chinese characteristics and probably thinking, alright, they allowed small businesses, opened their borders to investors, and granted tax benefits. But many countries did similar things in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Yet, it was China that became the world's largest economy. What's the secret? As soon as China opened up to the world, giants like Coca-Cola and General Motors rushed in, attracted by enormous opportunities outweighing the risks. First, China offered the cheapest labor force, and second, it presented a vast market waiting to be conquered. But here's the Chinese trick. The only way for foreigners to start a business in China was through a joint venture with a local producer. The foreign side provided capital and technology, while the Chinese side handled legal matters, logistics, and recruitment, including senior management. It turned out that China wasn't interested in merely becoming a market for others. It aimed to transform into a global manufacturing hub, supplying goods to all corners of the planet, reminiscent of its pre-Opium Wars era. While Western companies entered China, local businesses carefully absorbed their expertise and simply replicated their technologies. This straightforward, common method of catching up with leaders mirrors the story of early Soviet automobiles, most of which were based on American and Italian designs. Take for instance the Chevrolet Spark from 2003 by General Motors and the Chinese Cherokee Q from 2006. You'd struggle to find 10 differences between them. China didn't just copy technologies sporadically, it industrialized the process. And this isn't just about counterfeit clothing or branded bags. For example, in 2013, the FBI reported that Chinese companies attempted to smuggle genetically modified corn seeds out of the US to boost crop yields. Tesla in 2020 accused a former employee of stealing self-driving autopilot technology and passing it to Chinese competitors. This policy of replication saved China hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D, allowing it to leapfrog 10 to 20 years of research and catch up with market leaders. In the 2000s, China's R&D investments surged, soon surpassing those of countries from which it had previously borrowed technologies, like Japan and the European Union. Adding to this, the Communist Party prioritizes Chinese companies, whether private or state-owned, when granting subsidies and benefits. Over the past 2 decades, foreign companies have received significantly fewer incentives from the Chinese government than local businesses. Thanks to cheap labor, technology adoption, and state support, Chinese companies not only flooded markets with affordable products, outcompeting rivals, but also acquired some of them. For example, in 2010, Chinese automaker Geely purchased Sweden's Volvo cars, and in 2014, Lenovo acquired Motorola Mobility from Google. Here's an even more fascinating example. In the early 2000s, China bought high-speed trains and technologies from leading Western companies like Germany's Siemens and France's Alstom. For China, stretching thousands of kilometers from east to west, developing high-speed rail was vital. By 2007, China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation introduced its first high-speed train. Thanks to a massive domestic market, by 2015, CRRC was producing more than Siemens and Alstrom's rail divisions combined. It reached an absurd point. German state railway Deutsche Bahn expressed interest in purchasing Chinese trains over German ones because they were cheaper and were of same quality. During China's expansion into their markets, Siemens and Alstom attempted to merge their rail businesses into a single company. However, the EU blocked the merger, citing monopoly concerns. As for CRRC, it became the world's largest rail company by revenue. By the 2000s, the US was the global leader in critical technological research. Today, China has begun to replace it, excelling in everything from electric vehicles to globally popular apps. Naturally, the US retaliated. In 2016, Donald Trump imposed anti-dumping tariffs on foreign steel, slapping a 266% duty on Chinese products.
On the national security of the United States. It's not just the pricing, it's not just employment, it also has to do with the national security of our country.
In 2022, Joe Biden banned imports of Chinese telecom giant Huawei's products into the US.
I've made sure that the most advanced American technologies can't be used in China, not allowing to trade them there.
To understand why the US has become so agitated over China, just look at China's GDP structure. Nearly 40% of China's GDP comes from manufacturing, producing goods for the entire world. Such rapid expansion threatens to close American and European businesses while positioning China as the dominant force in key global industries. Ironically, the primary consumers of Chinese exports are the EU and the US. It is a vicious cycle. On one hand, Europe and the US worry about China pushing their companies out of vital markets. Yet, they cannot entirely abandon cheap Chinese goods because it's economically beneficial. On the other hand, China relies on solvent customers. Only 53% of its GDP comes from domestic consumption compared to 70 to 80% in developed countries. A country capable of consuming most of its production internally reflects economic stability. But in China's case, this figure has declined over the past 2 decades. One of the key reasons behind the US-China rivalry is that their confrontation has evolved beyond a mere trade war into a race to dominate third world countries. For instance, China provides loans to Sri Lanka for port modernization, but when the country fails to repay the debt, China, under the agreement, secures a 99-year lease on those ports. This strategy allows China to establish a strategic foothold in the Indian Ocean, both commercially and militarily. This in turn poses challenges to India, which traditionally considers the Indian Ocean its sphere of influence. Meanwhile, China is also constructing the New Silk Road, a trade route designed to span across Europe and Asia. The goal is to bypass the costly and unreliable Suez Canal route, giving China full control over the supply of its goods to key trade hubs worldwide. However, it's not as good as it seems. It's one thing to catch up to the leaders, but it's another to compete with them for the top position. When you're trailing behind, it's easier to grow quickly by copying technologies and benefiting from a low starting base. Thanks to this, China's economy grew consistently at rates exceeding 8% annually in the 2000s. But in recent years, its growth rate has slowed to levels comparable to the US economy because it now has to innovate new technologies independently and expend resources fighting for markets. Additionally, China's population has started to shrink in the past 2 years, a surprising development. From 1950 to 2023, China was the world's most populous country, but today, India has surpassed it. This is due not only to the global trend of population aging in developed countries, but also to the consequences of the one-child policy introduced in China in 1979. At the same time, the government imposed taxes and fines for having a second or subsequent child. The aim was to improve living standards, as economic growth was being offset by even faster population growth, which consumed the benefits. While this policy had some short-term positive effects, today it's clear that it was ultimately ineffective. The decline in birth rates has accelerated population aging and placed a heavier burden on the state budget, as pensions and benefits remain unchanged, and there are more elderly citizens too. Additionally, many families chose to terminate pregnancies upon learning they were expecting a girl, as everyone wanted a male heir. As a result, China now faces not only a shortage of young workers in certain industries, but also a gender imbalance, with many men unable to find wives. Although the government allowed 2 children in 2015 and 3 in 2021, birth rates have yet to increase significantly. In the end, China serves the entire world, but it faces significant problems with domestic demand. As discussed earlier, this imbalance is evident, for instance, in the periodic demolition of entire ghost towns filled with already constructed buildings across the country. Moreover, living standards in China have risen over the past 30 years, making labor increasingly expensive. Today, with its economic challenges and a unique socialist governance model, China is less attractive to investors. Companies like Intel, Nike, and Microsoft are considering relocating parts of their operations to cheaper or more stable locations like Bangladesh, Mexico, or Vietnam. Indeed, for the first time in 25 years, foreign direct investment in China is declining. So, reflecting on China's journey and its current position, one can't help but wonder, what's next? Will China continue its relentless rise, dominating the world, or will its brief leadership falter due to Western sanctions and internal challenges? Who will lead the global economy tomorrow? A resurgent China, the long-dominant United States, or an emerging India now flexing its muscles? It seems this is one of the most intriguing questions in global economics and geopolitics today. One will likely see answered within the next decade.